so excited that we're hosting this day of conversations about the climate crisis and music. We have 4 amazing panelists, 2 of them in the room, 2 of them virtual. This is a bit of an interesting hybrid experiment, and it's going to be an amazing conversation. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce Kim Fry, who will be facilitating the conversation. Kim, take it away.
Thank you so much, Eve, and thanks to everyone tuning in. I keep wanting to turn around to wave to the screen and the panelists behind me, but I know that they can't see me through that screen. They can see me through there. So hi, Fay and Kelly. So Kim Fry, I use she, her pronouns, and I am on the board of Music Declares Emergency Canada, and we've been working with Pop Montreal to program this day, and excited that this conversation is happening here and in other spaces across Canada at a lot of festivals. And so I want to introduce this panel, which focuses on green merch and follows up our previous panel, which was about live touring and venues. And there's a bit of overlap, which I'll get to. And so I want to introduce here in person with me is Jay Jolly, who I met because he works with both Carbon Brewery, which is a carbon neutral brewing company, which he'll tell us more about, and also Liquor Donuts, which is a vinyl press trying to do vinyl in a more sustainable way, which he'll also get to, and has just been a great supporter of Music Declares Emergency, the organization that I'm with that started less than 2 years ago, and so he's been very much a cheerleader for what we're doing. And then joining us virtually is the person who got Music Declares Emergency going around the world and kicked off an incredible movement, is Fay Milton, who's been an inspiration to lots of musicians and music industry folks and has really just made such a transformative impact on the music industry and is such a great expert. And Kelly Drennan is also joining us, and Kelly is with an organization called Fashion Takes Action. I used to teach at her daughter's elementary school many years ago, and that's how we met. And we turned to Kelly when we were looking at how we could make t-shirts and fashion more sustainable and ethical, and knowing that she really is one of the experts in Canada on that. And Kelly does have to go early. There's a family emergency. So I'm going to just quickly give a bit of context, hand it over to her to speak, and then we'll do a Q&A for Kelly before Jay and Fay speak, if that's okay with everyone. So so Kelly Drennan is with Fashion Takes Action and has been working on sustainable fashion for almost 2 decades. It's been a long time since she's been doing
15 years. Don't date me, Kim.
It's 15? Okay, 15 years. But she's been doing this work for a long time, has massive respect across Canada and around the world. And we know that the fashion industry has an enormous carbon footprint, in addition to the ethical considerations around fast fashion and the working conditions of many people who work in the textile industry around the world. And we also know that musicians are increasingly reliant on selling merch to actually make a living. And so I know many, many, many artists who feel that conundrum inside of them, of not wanting to make more things in this world where we're facing a climate emergency, but also recognizing that, you know, being a musician and having t-shirts they kind of go hand in hand. And so trying to figure out the best possible way to reconcile that. And so Kelly's going to talk to us about the impacts of the fashion industry, because sometimes it's important to be reminded of just how much of an impact there is and some of the solutions. So I'll hand it over to you, Kelly.
Thanks so much, Kim, and thank you to everybody on my panel today and to the organizers of the event to have me here. So happy to be here. I do have a presentation, so I'm going to just share this. Can everybody see that? Yeah? Okay, awesome. So as Kim mentioned, I'm the founding executive director of the nonprofit Fashion Takes Action. I started in 2007. And really our work is to advance sustainability across the entire fashion system. And so what I mean by that is we work with the industry. So we work with, you know, brands, retailers, but we also work with citizens and people who buy, wear, and dispose ultimately clothing. So I think I'm going to just give some context in terms of like the industry overall and the negative impacts that it has on the planet, which are many. So I am going to just briefly touch on these 5 areas that we really like to focus in on, which is carbon emissions, the use of water and the pollution of water, toxic chemicals, labor and human rights, and of course, waste. So the average t-shirt actually travels 25,000 kilometers before it lands on your back. So that's like driving across Canada 5 times. And that's because where the cotton is grown on the farm is likely in a different country than where it's actually processed or spun into a yarn and then turned into a fabric, cut and sewn, and then, shipped to a store near you. So in terms of emissions, transportation of the fashion industry is quite large. Also, when you consider that 67% roughly of our clothing is synthetic, which is basically plastic, so fabrics like polyester, nylon, acrylic, spandex, essentially they're crude oil. And roughly 342 million barrels of oil are used every single year to make polyester and synthetic textiles. So again, big emissions. In terms of water use, it takes anywhere from, was about 10 bathtubs full of water. I like to use the bathtub example because when you give people volume in liters and gallons, it's hard to kind of picture. But roughly it's 7 to 10 full bathtubs of water that goes into just making a single cotton t-shirt. And then there's the water pollution. So the textile industry, so not just fashion, but textiles in general, pollutes 5,640,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools of fresh water every single year. So there's a lot of problems in terms of the water pollution. And some of that comes from microfibers. So you may be familiar with microplastics. So these are these tiny little bits of plastics that are floating around in the ocean. Well, there's now microfibers, which are shed from our clothing. So even just wearing our clothes, polyester and synthetic textiles will shed these little tiny invisible microfibers, but primarily they're shed when we wash our clothes to the tune of about 700,000 every single time we do a load of laundry. And so these tiny little invisible microfibers are really problematic because not only are they showing up in fish, but they're also showing up now in human blood. So this is pretty alarming. Also, water pollution comes from the dyeing and the processing of textiles. And then oftentimes what happens is, especially in countries where there's pretty loose environmental laws, the factories which are located along riverbanks will just dump into the rivers. And, there's people say that you could actually, predict the next it color for the upcoming season based on the color of the rivers in some regions in China. And again, this is, just an example of a hidden pipe that would be dumping all of this effluent with highly toxic chemicals into local river and waters, which you can see is pretty devastating. And then, not only and I'll talk about the labor side and how workers are affected by handling all of these toxic chemicals, but the people who live nearby and rely on these water sources for drinking, for bathing, for even agriculture are really affected by this as well. Chemicals also show up in the fashion industry with respect to conventional cotton. So we have pesticides and fertilizers that are sprayed onto the plants. This is an example of a larger industrial farm where they use a crop duster to spray on these chemicals, which is also problematic for a number of reasons, but it can also be airborne. The chemicals are airborne and then can pollute. So even if there's an organic farm next door, it could be affected by these toxic chemicals that are airborne. And then on a smaller scale farm, the actual workers, the farmers themselves would walk through the fields spraying the plants, and oftentimes these tanks that they have on their backs are, faulty and they're old and they leak. And you can also see that he's not wearing any protection, like no glove, no mask, nothing. So lots of exposure to the workers. And on that note, labor is another pretty major impact area. Lots of human rights violations. Still to this day, sweatshops do exist. But the unsafe factory conditions, you may recall this tragedy that happened in Dhaka, Bangladesh in 2013, April 2013. And it's actually Fashion Revolution, which is an organization based in the UK, grew out of this tragedy that killed 1,100 garment workers and injured thousands more. And really, the cracks in the foundation were noticed, and some of the workers commented, and lots of them were afraid to go to work. But because of the pressure that brands put on the factory owners, they had to go to work. And then this tragedy happened. Child labor. I just noticed that this is a photo that, okay, anyway, child labor still exists, sometimes as young as 8 years old. Fashion is a low skilled labor industry. And so oftentimes that's why they employ children. And a lot of the time children are just forced to go to work, particularly if they work or if they're in a family where the parents are working in the garment industry, they get pulled out of school. And then this just perpetuates the whole cycle of poverty in some of those countries. And then lastly, waste, which is something that's a little bit closer to home. I think a lot of people think about some of those other things that I just talked about being kind of overseas and developing countries, and that's not really our problem, or it's out of sight, out of mind. Whereas waste is something that is definitely something that we can control. So there's 92 million tons of our clothing in landfills globally every single year. And we just did a study at Fashion Takes Action just to see how much in Canada was going into the landfill. And it's about 500,000 tons a year, which is still a lot. So, we really try and educate not only the industry on how to reduce, things like excess inventory and what to do with damaged goods and return goods, but also educating ourselves, right, about not just reduce, reuse, recycle, which everybody probably knows, but we have the 7 R's. So we added 4 more, which is repair, which is a big one because we need to keep our clothes in use for as long as possible. Resale. So, sell it if you don't want it anymore and you don't want to donate it. Rental. So you got a special occasion, don't buy something you're going to wear once, rent it. And repurposing, which is also kind of known as upcycling. But ultimately, we have to reduce because we buy 20% more clothes today than we did. We buy 60% more clothes today than we did 20 years ago. And we keep our clothes for half as long as we did then. So how can the music industry be more sustainable? Well, I'm glad that this is a topic at the symposium. Really excites me to see sustainability coming up in so many other industries. And I think hopefully I've given some context in terms of the impacts of fashion and sort of what to look for when you are sourcing any sort of textiles related merch. So things like sourcing, if you're going to use a cotton t-shirt, look for certified organic cotton, which means that the cotton wasn't grown with those chemicals, those pesticides and fertilizers. We're starting to see the use of recycled fibers as well in clothing. So if you go with a polyester, for example, try and make sure that there is some recycled content at least. It's not coming from polyester textiles yet. It's actually, when you see recycled on a label, it comes from plastic water bottles, believe it or not. But it's still better than using 100% virgin polyester. And zero waste design, so working with a pattern maker or like a t-shirt house or tote, whatever the product is, where they minimize waste either through the pattern cutting or they have a plan in place for that waste to either make scrunchies or to turn it into stuffing for poofs or pillows. So more and more companies are starting to focus on zero waste design as well. Upcycling old products into new is always fun. And especially at like a music festival, it could be a really fun project where you have like, totes or t-shirts from like last year or 5 years ago that, you've got sitting somewhere and you need to repurpose them somehow. So you can always turn a t-shirt into a tote bag or into a plant hanger or wall art or all kinds of things that you can be doing. I think it's really important to also not overproduce. I don't really know statistics with bands and concertees and stuff, but that's definitely a problem is sort of over projecting the number of t-shirts that are going to sell and then having all this inventory left over. So it's always important to be more mindful, I think, of how much you're actually producing. And then, of course, whenever you can, try and source locally. I mean, we don't grow cotton in Canada, so the whole t-shirt won't have been made in Canada, but definitely looking for somebody who cut and sews locally. And then if it isn't local, look for, fair trade, which there is a fair trade certification for apparel products. And that just basically certifies that the workers were paid fair wages and working in safer conditions. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I'm going to kick off because we're going to do our questions for Kelly now, if you've just joined us, because she does have to go a bit early. And I have a question for you. We came to you as Music Declares Canada last year saying we wanted to do the No Music on a Dead Planet t-shirts. Jay's wearing one, I'm assuming that he got from the UK, where they're working with a print-on-demand company. And we wanted to do a Canadian design. So this is Kurt Swinghammer who designed this one. And we wanted to do our own version of the Anthony Burrell. This is the very first Music Declares t-shirt, correct, Fay? The very first design. So we wanted to do some in Canada locally. And we went to Kelly and said, okay, how do we do this? Who do we go to? So if a band were to come to you and say, tell us the ideal case scenario of doing it in the best possible way, what would you say to them?
Well, yeah, I'm not familiar necessarily with t-shirt houses in the area here, but just some of those points that I said at the end, I think do your homework when you're doing some of that research in terms of where to get the t-shirts, where to source them from, and ask those kinds of questions. Do they have a product that they consider sustainable, and how do they consider it sustainable? What are the fibers that are used to make that t-shirt? Do they have any zero waste sort of design policies or practices? And I think that, it's great that you guys are doing on demand. I think that's what I was talking about in terms of that over producing. You definitely don't want to have all this inventory left over afterwards where you don't know what to do with it. So yeah, so I can't really say, oh, look up these folks. They're great, because I don't necessarily work directly in that sort of space. But I think that being armed with those questions to ask is a good starting point.
Thank you. Are there any questions from any of you in the audience? Yeah, Marie. Oh. If you want to come up, and there's a mic, or just so that folks at home can hear you, and folks in the future. Thanks.
Okay. I'm just wondering about some kind of consumer sort of watchdog, umbrella organization, or something that could help us, because sometimes when we do the research on whether or not this is sustainable fiber, is this going to produce off-gassing, are there children making these things? What we're hearing is that the retail sector is so competitive that there can be, kind of information out there that's not fair and not true, and but then we don't know where to go to get reliable information about those really critical factors. Can you?
Yeah, that is definitely problematic, and you're starting to see in Europe. The EU is just always so far ahead of us, but there's even in California as well. You're starting to see things like anti-greenwashing legislation come into place now, because so many of these companies are making these kinds of claims. I think it's really important and this is where certifications come into play, because if they don't carry a certification, then there's a very good chance that they're not being completely truthful. I think that we're also, from a legislation perspective, so no, there is no consumer watchdog, just straight up in Canada, for sure, there isn't anything like that. But I do know that, especially also with the US, legislation has been introduced around labor practices, particularly also there's the Uyghur Act, which is, so there's cotton, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there's a particular region in China, the Xinjiang region, and 80,000 Uyghur Muslims were forced to grow and pick and the cotton there. So the U.S. has imposed a ban now. So any brand that was sourcing from that region is no longer able to sell that product in the U.S. So those are the kinds of things I think that are going to help. But But yeah, it just, the onus really comes down to the individual, the consumer, to sort of do the research. And again, certifications, really, so there's GOT certification, which is a global organic textile standard. So if you are looking for organic cotton, look for it to be GOT certified. Again, the fair labor or fair trade certification is another really good one that handles this to the labor side. And then you look at like a B Corp. So if the company is a B Corp, that's the best thing really, actually, because it covers like all of the whole gamut, the whole like environmental, social, community, employees. Like it's a pretty rigorous process to get certified B Corp. So those are three I'd say that you should really be looking for. And if they don't have them, then chances are they're not telling the whole truth.
Thanks for that. Anyone else? Okay. Thank you so much for joining us, Kelly. Really great to see you. And we'll see you in a few weeks at the Canadian Music Climate Summit. Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, I have to leave. But thank you for understanding. And I hope the rest of this discussion goes well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I think I'm going to jump to our next virtual guest, Fay, because I think Fay might be a nice transition. Fay can talk a little bit about Music Declares Emergency as a global organization, the work that they've done around merch, and also some of the work that's been done on vinyl. And then Jay can talk about what that's looking like here in Canada. And then we'll have Q&A for both of them. So I'm going to pass it over to Fay Milton.
Hi, Kim. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's really nice to be here. So some of the work we've been doing with Music Declares Emergency. So Music Declares Emergency in the UK started in 2019 as a reaction to the sort of the news that came out that we had more or less sort of 12 years left and no one was taking it seriously. And Greta was around doing her thing, Extinction Rebellion, and David Attenborough has started really sort of hammering home the messages. And within this sort of big swell of energy, a lot of people in the UK, or sort of a small group of us in the UK who were in the music industry, all found each other and decided that music needed its own group. Music in general, the music industry wasn't facing up to this challenge. Also creatively and culturally, we didn't see music itself facing the reality of the situation. So we do a lot of work in the cultural side of things. So we obviously promote sustainability, but we're not primarily a sustainability group. We're really, really working on how to communicate the climate crisis through music and through the music industry. How to bring everyone on board and build positivity and hope around climate solutions, and also how to kick the music industry's ass into making it speed up. So we started then. Since then, we've got groups now in the US, Canada, Chile, Netherlands, Germany, France, Poland, Portugal, Switzerland, and Austria. I'm reading that off a piece of paper because I always forget. So it's turning into an international movement. Hopefully along the line, we can say it's global when we have groups in further places in the world. So we started in 2019, as I said, and it was before the pandemic. So we were planning to go to loads of events and print our main message, no music on the dead planet, onto people's existing clothing. We had screen prints, we had block prints, and we thought this was the best way to go. Lo and behold, everything shuts down and we couldn't do anything. So we were approached by a t-shirt company, or actually another company we were working at introduced us to a t-shirt company who have incredible sustainable credentials. And we thought long and hard about whether or not it was the right thing to do to create t-shirts for our campaign. But we decided, yes, we should. This is the actual bigger change, and the cultural shift is worth promoting, even if it uses some materials. So yeah, we got an amazing design. which was created by an artist called Anthony Burrell in the UK, and started with that. And what we found out about this t-shirt company called T-Mill is that they have several sustainable practices that we found to be really robust. So first of all, they obviously use organic cotton. That's a given. They use rainwater irrigation for that cotton. They have renewable energy throughout the supply chain, and they're sort of wholly sort of sustainably produced. But on top of that, they're print to order. So there's no leftover stock. And I think that's already come up today as quite an important thing. I was playing in a band before, and we would have all of these t-shirts left over after a tour, old t-shirts with the old artwork on, and you just end up throwing them away because you buy all these different sizes and not everything sells. So in music, there's a lot of leftover stuff that either gets stored for a long time and then sent to landfill, or just sent straight to landfill. So they're all printed to order. And then the really, really nice thing about them is that it's a circular production. So what this means is that when they make one of their t-shirts and they send it out to you, you can then, once you finish wearing it, you can send it back to them, and you get store credit with the shop, with the T-Mill store, and they recycle that t-shirt because it's 100% cotton. The whole thing gets chucked in the recycler and turned into new t-shirts. So in the best practice version of this, nothing gets wasted, and there is just like a really smooth system. Obviously, in reality, not everyone's going to send their t-shirts back, but the more and more that practices like that become the norm, then the more people will think to do it and realize that that's a possibility. So we did decide to do t-shirts, and they've gone really, really well, and have really helped to spread the message of music declares emergency. One of the ways is that artists have found them really easy and nice to wear. They're beautiful t-shirts, as Kim showed earlier. They've got a really great design on. And another thing is that fans have really sort of responded to them. They've bought the t-shirts, and then wherever someone is wearing that t-shirt, they're then showing that they believe in the cause. And that was one of the major problems that we find in the UK, and I'm sure it's the same internationally, is that the majority of people are extremely worried about climate change, but people don't talk about it. It's this kind of underground thing that people are anxious about, worried about, completely baffled by, and politicians and governments are not responding to because people are not discussing it. It's not on the headlines every day. It's not, what people are discussing on social media for the main part. So it's this really kind of enormous thing that has to be spotlighted and has to be brought into the mainstream. So the key thing that these t-shirts are doing is screaming, I care about climate change, every time someone wears one. So we think it's worth doing because it's really sort of playing a part in the communication side of things.
Thank you so much. I think we need to get something like a T-Mill in Canada, because there is no supplier that I'm aware of that does.
They are, yeah, they absolutely are extending to the US, I believe, but not Canada yet. But I was going to say, thinking about what Kelly was saying before, and that she wasn't sure of like exactly where to go. I think there's a real opening for someone to come in and do this right in Canada. It's like such an opportunity for a new business to come in and say, we're doing this in this way, follow the model that a company like T-Mill are using, and then go maybe through Music Declares Canada out to the music industry and say, we're doing this right. Because people are starting to realize what greenwashing is, and are starting to realize that when something says it's sustainable, it doesn't necessarily mean it is. People are getting really wise to it. So I think there's a massive opportunity there.
I think so too. Good. If anyone out there is looking to start up a new business, I think there's a real great business case for it. We can talk after. So I'm going to pass it over to Jay Jolly, who's an incredible entrepreneur with a sustainability focus with everything that he does, to talk about what he's doing with Carbon Brewery, with Liquor Donuts, and with your film company as well.
Well, thanks for inviting me to be here today. My name is Jay Jolly. I am, unfortunately, a serial entrepreneur, but more and more, my focus is to kind of go beyond what a regular business is, no matter what I do. So I think part of, why I'm here today is actually, to talk about, I have a vinyl pressing business that's also a brokerage that is called Liquor Donuts. It's very Ontario focused. More and more, what I've been looking at is the greatest impact sometimes you can have is just being hyper-local and just really looking at how tight you can make your community and how close you can actually just, if your plans aren't just infinite growth, you can actually do a lot of good. And so, especially coming out of the pandemic, it was really important to me that every venture that I'm involved in, it doesn't matter if you're a musician or, you're somebody making widgets, just call it. You want to give a great, experience, entertainment, product, whatever you want to call that output that you do. Obviously you want to be sustainable, you want to make a little bit of a profit, you want to pay your rent. But the third is that kind of triple bottom line is within your business model, how are you giving back? And that doesn't necessarily just have to be around climate change, it can be around social change. And more than anything, it should always begin in your backyard. It could be just giving back 10% of your time to helping young people, raise them up. Behavioral change, it could be just providing access to people that didn't have it. But for instance, if we pick one example, so for vinyl, vinyl's always been one of those really interesting. I'm a collector and very passionate. I was a touring musician for years in the 90s, to date myself. And I've always had, a real, musicians and helping musicians have always been a big part of my DNA. So when we started Liquor Donuts, it was originally going to be a live venue with a vinyl press in it in Toronto, and then COVID hit. So we had to pivot our business model. We got kind of the shit kicked out of us too. But what I realized, despite how bad I was, musicians were a lot worse off than I was. Because a lot of those, not only couldn't tour, but a lot of them had hospitality jobs. And so part of us, instead of just looking at just being, we were always focused on independent, short run, quick turnaround kind of stuff. But increasingly it became, well, why don't we just figure out if we can, shine a spotlight on what musicians are going through. So we launched an initiative called 33.3, which was 33 curators picking 33 songs by 33 Ontario artists. We really made it quite small. The record was cut, plated, and pressed within a 5-kilometer area. And it'll be coming out very shortly. It too got impacted by all the supply chains. But yeah, it was really great. We've raised almost $45,000 for local musicians or Ontario musicians. But that, for our business model, was a way that we could, have that triple bottom line and show that, we're not just here to exploit and push out product and stuff like that. We need to be part of the community and part of the solution. And just, and a lot of people would say, the vinyl, well, it's a lot of plastic, it's a lot of this. Actually, it's not as bad as you think it is. There's a lot more carbon emissions coming out of Spotify than there ever was in plastic product, being that CDs, tape, or anything. Like a record, after you listen to it 8 times, actually becomes carbon neutral. I have records that are over 50 years old that have been passed down for 4 generations. In a lot of ways, a record is affordable luxury that you're not going to throw out. It's not disposable. Where if you get on Spotify, you're chewing through singles all day long. And remember, servers are powered by, coal. A lot of this is coal power. It's not like something green or something that's, there's a lot of feeling that, that PVC is bad. Well, there's more carbon footprint now coming out of streaming than there ever was during physical format when it was plastic driven.
Thank you. And, you're so right. There's an assumption that the invisibility of streaming, that it's because there's nothing physical or tangible, it must be so much better and greener. And I've had lots of people say that to me. And I think that idea of records passing through generations, I have records that belong to my grandfather and records that belong to my parents is absolutely true. It also changes the way that you listen to music, so you're not like consuming it in that kind of short spurt way, it's kind of like more of a relationship, I think. And maybe I'll throw it to Fay to say, in addition to that, there's work being done in the UK to try and make vinyl even more sustainable. And before I throw it over to say that, again, one of the things we're hoping to do when we do our summit is get some of the major labels in the room, because we also know that, and I'm assuming any musicians here are independent musicians or small, with a small label. When Taylor Swift announced her new record, I know a lot of independent musicians who are in the queue to get their vinyl pressed were like, because they know there's limited capacity, and someone like Taylor Swift's record will bump all the other people who've been in the queue to get their 1,000 or 300 print run done. That's small potatoes, and so she will take priority over them, and that's because there are no vinyl presses owned by any of the major labels. It's all smaller ones, and there's a huge carbon impact when people are going to the Czech Republic, most of the record labels here, to get their vinyl pressed, or pressing plant in Canada shipping out all over the world. So what can be done? Are there any plans afoot to build more sustainable, maybe highly efficient record vinyl presses? And what's happening with vinyl in the UK? I know the Music Declares has been doing some interesting things there.
Yeah, so, well, first of all, it's another fantastic entrepreneurial opportunity to open a vinyl pressing place, at least on your side of the Atlantic. That would be a really good idea for someone. But yeah, so we launched the world's first, I believe, bioplastic vinyl release with a company called Evolution Music. They're out of the UK, a small startup aimed at making vinyl sustainable. So their first product is a bioplastic vinyl, which is made from plant products. It's completely plant-based, and it is biodegradable in the machine. So it's so complicated plastic, so I'm not an expert, but it's one step away. The next product they have will be completely biodegradable. So at the moment, we're completely fossil fuel free with these records. And they're much, much better for the environment already, with the goal to create vinyls, or don't call them vinyls anymore because they're not vinyl, but to create records that are completely compostable bioplastic. So it's an amazing new product. The sound quality is like 99% as good. It's like just they're finishing off the last bits and bobs to really get it sounding 100% as good. But honestly, on any home speaker setup, it's going to sound exactly as good. They're listening on proper mastering systems, and you can hear a tiny bit of noise here and there, but it's, and a home system, absolutely just as good. And yeah, it was a really exciting project. So the first ever bioplastic vinyl we launched with Secretly and Ninja Tune record labels, and it had 4 tracks on from Bicep, Black Country New Road, Porridge Radio, and Angel Olsen. And yeah, we produced, only 20 of them were produced, and we did a prize draw to fundraise, which is unfortunately closed now, but we'll hopefully do some more again. So that's a really exciting product that's coming up. And there's also, I've got no backing for this, but I've heard there's talk of a vinyl pressing plant that is pressing on demand as well. So that's a really exciting movement that may be happening. But at the moment, it's really about the bioplastic vinyls, and we're really pushing those. But I would also say, alongside what Evolution Music are doing with the bioplastic, there's a really exciting new format that's charter accredited in the UK, and it's a Web3 format called a digital pressing. So it's all the things you'd expect from a vinyl. So like beautiful sound quality, all the artwork, extra bits and bobs. You've got that excitement of opening the package, seeing what's inside, but it all happens in a Web3 platform. So it's a bit like similar to an NFT. It has there's like only a certain number of them made, so you can't just replicate and replicate. So it's got really high value and resale value if you're into sort of swapping and sharing and that sort of Discogs world. And that has an incredibly low emissions carbon footprint. It's the new, it's part of the proof of stake Ethereum blockchain. Sorry, I'm so out of my depth talking about this stuff. It's part of the Ethereum new sort of low energy blockchain. I think it's like you'd have to make 1 million of them or so to use the same energy as you would in the same emissions as a record. So it's probably, people love to have something that they hold and to have something that they can hand down to generations. Potentially that happens with Web3 products. At the moment, we say like bioplastic is brilliant for that. But when it comes to streaming, maybe that sort of constant energy use, you're constantly playing it, you're constantly using servers all over the world. And as Jay was saying, it's sort of this like hyper consumerist way of listening to music. So you just listen to everything all the time. And, you know, you don't really build a relationship with music in the same way if you're consuming so much of it. So the Web3 digital pressing could be a really interesting new way of doing that. So you really have this music, the artwork, a connection, all these sort of things you can do with NFTs as well, special interviews and content from the artist can all be part of the package. And you have, it's something that you own and you can really sort of hold on to. So I'm really excited about that possibility as well. I've never bought an NFT. I'm not, as you can tell, I'm not talking about it from this like technical point of view. I just think it's looking to the future and how things are going. It could be a really exciting way to have like virtually emissions-free music products.
That's a nice alternative to the NFTs, which are highly carbon intensive. And I know
what they are if they're on like the dirty blockchain.
Yeah.
It's all about what blockchain they use.
Right.
This is a whole nother panel. So that's
totally.
the NFTs they can be incredibly polluting, but there's this new sort of form of blockchain that's like way less polluting. So hopefully everything is going to go that way. But at the moment, it's like Ethereum and some other bits and bobs.
Good. That's good.
Google it.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be way more accurate and to the point than what I'm saying. But it's, essentially you can do NFTs really, really, really low carbon nowadays.
Excellent. That's good to hear. One of the things that's different maybe between the UK and Canada is we're a huge country, which is challenging when you're a musician. And vinyl is big and heavy and hard to transport. And we all know it's much more affordable to do a press run of 400 than a press run of 100. But if you are doing a cross-country tour, you end up having to take all of that with you. Now, Jay, you've talked about the kind of partnering, the potential of partnering between smaller vinyl presses so that you're like pooling. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that idea?
Absolutely. So, building on what Fay says, actually, Canada's done some of the, so it has some incredible vinyl pressing innovation. One of the biggest ones is Viral Technologies out of Etobicoke. So they're building the best presses in the world right now. And you got to remember that vinyl presses for a long time before this boom, when Record Store Day really took off about, I think it's almost 15 years now. And realized vinyl has been growing double digits every year. Like this year was bigger than anything. Last year it outsold CDs. It doesn't look like it's going to end. So Viral, they're the first presses. Again, when you look at old 20th century manufacturing process, a lot of these presses are very inefficient. They're like held together by like baling wire and gaffer tape because they're like 60-year-old technology. So Viral started about 5 years ago, and they built the first steamless press, which means you didn't need a big, huge boiler, which takes up a lot of energy. And they're also all computer controlled. So the idea of, vinyl weighs a ton, literally weighs a ton. Like you want to move vinyl around, it's like petrochemicals for days. It's a pain in the ass. And to the point of, in the vinyl boom, you're always looking at like, well, say Taylor Swift, she has to identify some plants that can literally pump out like, high six figures, low seven figures in terms of numbers, ridiculous numbers. So viral, what's really cool about it is, they're developing this hive. So if these vinyl presses all over the world, in fact, Vinyl Me Please just built their whole vinyl plant all with viral presses. Theoretically, a label could just focus on cutting the lacquer, cutting all the plates they need, and sending them to viral presses all over the world, because they can all dial in the exact same temperature. The record will always sound the same. It'll be the same record essentially, but it will be produced locally. So Australia, viral presses will produce there and only ship there. Same with everything. So it breaks up the chain. So I really think you're right. Canada's huge, and it's nothing. Everything's expensive to move it around here. But if you could imagine all of these regions across having either one of these warm tone presses, that moves the needle, absolutely. And again, it comes back to this kind of locality or hyper locality of just trying to make that work.
Right.
It's amazing it's not done like that anyway.
Yeah. And think about it as a musician. If you're doing a cross-country tour and you're starting in Vancouver, you pick up 100 vinyl in Vancouver that are pressed there, and then maybe once you get to Winnipeg, there's I'm just making this up. Then you pick up the next 100, and it saves you having to cart all of that with you all the time, and it brings something to those different communities. So I think the idea of hyper local and very local is a really important one to explore. And on that, do you want to just touch on Carbon and then some of what you have done in the very short period that Carbon Brewing's been around to support? You supported our organization and others, and you have a Jedi beer. Talk about that one too.
So this was kind of I live in a place called Wolf Island, which is the biggest island in the Thousand Islands, just outside of Kingston. Fabienne, my partner, she's sitting at the back. We were living in Toronto about 2.5 years ago during the pandemic, in the typical 700 square foot condo. And it got pretty cagey. 2 6 feet tall people living and working in the same kind of room. And I had gone to school in Kingston, and I ended up we visited there on a weekend just to stop from killing each other. And I happened to go over to Wolf Island. I met an old friend, a music friend that was looking to buy the Wolf Island Hotel, which is a little music destination on the island. His name's Chris Brown. He used to play in the Bourbon Tabernacle Choir and is a very well-known musician. So I helped him with his business plan for that. But while I was on the island, and Fab and I were living there at the hotel to help him out, I decided to take a tour, and two of the people that I brought to help write the business model for the hotel were the two, Tyson and Eve, that were these hospitality dudes from Toronto. And we took a drive, and this is kind of, you accidentally start a company by driving down a dirt road, very much like, it sometimes happens apparently. And we went for a tour of the island, and we were driving by, and we were like, oh my God, those are hops yards, like on the island. We were like, wow. So we drove down, we met the two farmers, Grace and John, both very good friends of mine. In fact, Grace, my hops farmer for Carbon, is now my production manager on the feature we're shooting right now in Kingston, which is another hyper-local project. So she, again, had a lot of transferable skills, had worked at City TV. But what I found out when I drove down there, and again, I like beer, I like wine, I like a bourbon as well. But it was really, when she was talking, like nobody was buying their hops. They had like some of the most beautiful hops in the world, and she told me that craft brewers in Ontario, and I think this probably applies to any province, potentially even La Belle Province ici, is less than 0.6% of these craft brewers actually buy local ingredients. Most of their hops come from Brazil, New Zealand, Washington State, and I was like, and I thought it was kind of shocking. It was like, really? So they're, because you think of craft, you think of farm to table, you think of all this stuff, but no, all these things are coming from somewhere else. So it kind of said, well, we should help these guys out. We should make some beer, and we all started churning. But I said, we can't just make a beer, and that was kind of where Tyson and Eve really kind of put their thinking caps on. What is the triple bottom line? Yeah, we're going to help a local farmer. That's great. But what we realized is, if you're going to change climate, you have to change 20th century manufacturing processes. You have to radically rethink the way it's done. Still deliver that great experience, that great crushable beer, And again, we have a lager, we have the Jedi, which again, that's the social part of us, which is the justice, equality, diversity, or equity, sorry. I always get
Equity
this wrong.
inclusion.
Yeah, includes that. Thank you. I know. And each of our beers has, it talks about climate. So each of them has a story. It's meant to kind of instigate conversation, I guess is a good way to say it. But the biggest part about it was just kind of is how do we, when we're talking about, disposable clothes, like it takes 7 glasses of water to make 1 glass of beer, There is so much CO2 that just kind of goes into the atmosphere that you can actually trap in a circular economy that will actually power the brewery. All the spent grains can be used for all kinds of different things. And so the more we looked at it, the more we were like, okay, let's really become a clean tech company that just happens to make crushable beer. So we're actually a technology company. And so about 6 months ago, we partnered with the University of Trent in Peterborough to become one of, I think, only 2 or 3 breweries ever built on a university campus. So we're going to be a research facility and really bring these kind of looking at how to change these technologies so we're carbon negative. So we're actually putting more energy back than we take. But the other thing is we're only going to brew a certain amount of capacity of our beer. What we'd like to do is open up and be a co-packer, so all these other kind of craft brewers who need to use a co-packer, if they use us, they can get that carbon negative seal on their can too, because our belief is in the future, more retail on that is going to look for carbon negative products. And so, it's kind of like the better beer for a better world, kind of. So that's what really attracted me and that strong bottom line. And it all started with that kind of hyper-local mindset of let's figure out how to help this farmer. And, and if you know the first name of your supplier, that's a great step towards it.
Amazing. That's so cool. And I didn't know about the Trent thing. That's a new development. So, and exploring being a B Corp, is that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're already, we do a bunch of things like 1% to the planet. We use bullfrog power. We plant like 5,000, 10,000 trees up in the north. We do a lot of stuff like that. But yeah, B Corps, it's a steep, like, and I always tell people, and people are like, oh my God, I got to become a B Corp. I'm like, hey, take it easy. You don't need to boil the ocean. You know what? Just do little change, and eventually you'll get there. You don't have to be a B Corp overnight. Just kind of do meaningful, thoughtful things when you make decisions. And that goes for like, if you're a band, just kind of like really kind of think you don't have to be the perfect, ecological steward today. You can be pretty good and just kind of think about your community, think about your impact, think about, how you can include people from the community. Like we're doing on our film productions, we're training 60% of my crew right now on this film. We've got 36 people are from the community. Many of them are being trained for the first time to work in film production. So again, that's a nice hyper-local mindset.
Nice. Any questions for Fay and Jay from the audience? And if you do have a question, the mic is right here. It's ideal if you come up to the mic, just because then those watching from home and in the future can hear your question. Any questions? All right. I'll maybe just on the circular economy, Fay, say, and I don't know if this is something you can speak to, if it's happening anywhere else, but one of the projects that we've talked about a little bit at Music Declares to feel good about manufacturing T-shirts, given that there isn't something like T-Mill here, is wanting to work with music venues. Does anyone here connected to a music venue? Yeah, wanting to work with some music venues to have boxes where they kind of live at the venue. You know how during like a food drive, there might be a box where people would put the food, something like that, and encouraging people, if they have old merch that doesn't fit them or they don't like it anymore, that they drop the old music merch T-shirts in those boxes. And then we as Music Declares, our volunteers would collect them, every couple months, go through them, and if they're in good shape, we might then sell them at a low cost, like $5 as a donation that goes towards us. And whatever we don't sell, we would bring it to, there's a textile manufacturing or textile recycling plant in Markham, north of Toronto, and we would bring it there to kind of make it a little bit more circular and to get people thinking about when they're buying shirts and then they see that box to be like, oh yeah, do I really need this? Or like just kind of like to just plant that seed of that question of like, oh yeah, stuff does end up in the landfill, and here's a way that we can kind of close that a little bit. I'm not sure if there's anything, because Europe is usually ahead of us, that you've seen.
I think that's a great idea, Kim. It's so nice to hear that idea, and I can just imagine that happening here. I think the one of the things for artists to think about and labels is what function does merch perform? It's something that connects you physically with the artist that you love. So it's something you can hold in your hand, something that you can sort of take home, show to people. With a t-shirt, as I was saying earlier, you put on your Metallica t-shirt, you're hoping to bump into someone who thinks Metallica is cool, and they'll be like, cool band. It's that kind of, it's community, it's connection, and all of these things. And also for the band, obviously, or the artist, it's making money, it's keeping going, it's keeping funding all the people that you're paying to take you on tour, and all of the, the company that is your band. So does that have to be t-shirts? I think that's what people need to think about. T-shirts, cotton, polyester, it's pretty bad for the environment. Could it be something else? Could it be reusable water bottles, notepads? Does it have to be something that you physically buy? Could there be another way of doing it? Do meet and greets? I don't know, I'm thinking off the top of my head here in a way, but thinking about the function that merch plays and deciding whether or not that has to be a t-shirt, maybe like a little pin badge that's really exclusive, or there's different things you could do that are less polluting, that still you can still make money from, and still give your audience something to have and to hold, and to show to other people that they support you. And a lot of the reasons why people want to buy merch is because they know that artists don't get paid very well for their music these days, so unless you're a huge artist. So people want to support artists, maybe normalizing things like Patreon more, so people can actually support their artists without having to fill up their closet with merch that they really don't need because they've already got a ton of t-shirts. So I think, as Jay was saying, it's like looking at the business model of the whole thing. Musicians should be paid more for their music, so they don't have to create merch. They're not t-shirt companies. But until that changes, then maybe think about what you're selling and how you're selling it, and be super creative if you want to change things up and shake things up.
Thank you. Thanks. Any final words, Jay, Fay? I mean, I want to encourage everybody to, if you haven't already signed the declaration, we have it at the back. We have a banner. There's a QR code, and we have a statement of commitments. And we, as Music Declares Emergency Canada, are very committed to, working with other organizations that are working at the intersection of arts and climate, like the Creative Green Tools, who spoke at our earlier panel, to really work with labels, with artists, with management companies, and to help you make new decisions and forge a new path. And we're really excited that this movement is global, and we're able to plug in and learn from things happening in other places. And I'm so grateful to Fay for having kickstarted what I think is just an amazing movement. And we're finding a real openness and appetite for these conversations here in Montreal, Calgary, at Breakout West, at Folk Music Ontario. And that's really heartening to know that if we create the demand, we will be able to get some of the things that they have in the UK. We're going to see bioplastics here. We're going to see the hyper-local vinyl presses. We're going to hopefully see better merch and more options, so that we're not always defaulting to t-shirts. So thank you so much for your stories, for your inspiration, for your work, and your commitment to this. And
no problem.
Thanks to everybody.
Kim, I'll just remind people, in case they're interested, it's serenade.co if you want to look into the eco-friendly digital pressing. That's the Web3 thing. And it's Evolution Music if you want to look into the bioplastic vinyl. So awesome. Just to remind people on those.
Thanks so much.
And thank you so much for having me. Whilst I've got the floor, I'll say that it's brilliant to see all this work happening in Canada. And it's also completely surreal that by the magic of the internet, I'm sitting in my living room, but I'm also there with you. on the wall. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Faye. It was really fun.
Thank you.
And Liquor Donuts, what's your web address?
Liquordonuts.com.
There we go. Carbon Brewery. It's great beer. I've had some. If any of you are in Toronto, Handlebar in Toronto is definitely one of the places that you can get it, but there's lots of others, and hope to see you around the festival. Thanks so much. We'll have more workshops later this afternoon.